Hey folks, in this, our second lecture on the endocrine system, we're going to be looking at major endocrine glands. This is covered in chapter 18 in our textbook. And essentially, we are going to go from head to tail, from superior to inferior, looking at the most significant endocrine glands. All right, our first endocrine organ is the hypothalamus. So you learned in ANP1 that the hypothalamus is a critical brain structure. It is the center of many homeostatic mechanisms such as thirst and hunger, a really crucial but small region of the brain. So a fascinating thing about the hypothalamus is that it is both neuron, nervous, and endocrine hormone producing structure. At least there are neurons within the hypothalamus that are neuroendocrine. So these are typical neurons, but when their vesicles release their chemical messengers, they do not go into a synaptic cleft, they go into the bloodstream, right? So they are hormone secreting neurons. This is a sagittal section of the human head, and we can see the hypothalamus there positioned just above the pituitary gland and just below the thalamus. So this slide focuses on the embryonic development of not only the hypothalamus, but also the pituitary gland. The top image shows a 4-week-old human embryo. We can see the structure called the neural hypophyseal bud, the future hypothalamus, and the pituitary diverticulum. Those are the three structures that we're interested in here. So the future hypothalamus is self-explanatory. That's the part of the diencephalon that will form the hypothalamus. But the neural hypophyseal bud, this downgrowth from the hypothalamus, is the future posterior lobe of the pituitary. The pituitary diverticulum, an outgrowth from the roof of the pharynx, is the future anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So if you look at that lower right, or left rather, where it says 8 weeks, we see that that outgrowth from the roof of the pharynx pinches off and comes into contact with that hypophyseal pouch. The two merge together to form the pituitary gland. That gland has 2 discrete lobes. They have totally different embryonic origins. So the hypothalamus is in control of the pituitary gland. We call the pituitary gland the master endocrine organ, but it is itself controlled by the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary by producing hormones. So there are hormones that fall into 2 categories. Releasing hormones are chemical signals from the hypothalamus to tell the anterior pituitary to make and release certain hormones. And inhibiting hormones are chemical messengers sent by the hypothalamus to prevent the anterior pituitary from making and releasing certain hormones. The hypothalamus also makes hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary gland doesn't actually make any of its own hormones, but rather it is the point of release into the systemic circulation for hormones that are actually made by neuroendocrine cells in the hypothalamus. So in this image, we see the pituitary gland, the anterior versus the posterior lobe. We see all these hormones produced by those structures, and we can see the neurons up there in the hypothalamus that are the neuroendocrine cells that are controlling what's happening in the pituitary. Okay, so this figure is showing the hormonal communication between hypothalamus, pituitary, and then a generic peripheral endocrine cell. So notice we look back up at the hypothalamus, we see both green and red arrows. The green arrows and the green dots represent releasing hormones made by the hypothalamus targeting the anterior pituitary, and the red arrows and red dots indicate inhibiting hormones made by the hypothalamus targeting the anterior pituitary. So under the influence of releasing hormones, the anterior pituitary will make and release tropic hormones. Tropic hormones are hormones that target peripheral endocrine glands and cause them to secrete their own hormone. And then we have feedback happening. As blood levels of peripheral hormones rise, it will prevent the anterior pituitary from making the tropic hormone and or prevent the releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus. Okay, so now let's talk about how the hypothalamus is connected to and actually controls the two different lobes of the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus has a vascular connection to the anterior pituitary. There is a small network of blood vessels which directly connects the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. This is what we call a portal system. Portal systems are capillaries that drain into a vessel that break back up into capillaries again. And oh man, get ready for this. Here's the name of this portal system. It is called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal. How do you like that? So hypothalamo refers to the idea that it starts in the hypothalamus, and hypophyseal is the fancy word for the pituitary. So this is the hypothalamic to anterior pituitary network of blood vessels, the portal. So this is the circulatory route by which those releasing and inhibiting hormones get to go directly from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. The hypothalamus has a nervous connection to the posterior pituitary. Remember, the posterior pituitary is essentially just a downgrowth of the hypothalamus. So we have a bundle of axons that run through the stalk connecting the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. That bundle of axons is called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. You might remember that word tract in the spinal cord, for example. We have ascending and descending tracts. So this is, again, a bundle of axons. The cell bodies of these axons are up in the hypothalamus, and the terminus of these axons are in the posterior pituitary gland, so that when their hormones are released, they can exit and enter the systemic circulation. So our image here shows that tract, right? So we see, for example, 3 neuroendocrine cells up in the hypothalamus. The cell bodies collectively form a nucleus called the supraoptic nucleus. The axons run down through the stalk. They form that hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. The ends of those axons terminate in the posterior pituitary gland, and when their hormones are released from them, they enter the systemic circulation to target peripheral tissues. This graphic depicts the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal. So again, we have some neuroendocrine cells up in the hypothalamus. If they get stimulus from elsewhere in the nervous system, they will release stimulatory hormones, and if they get inhibitory effects, they will release inhibitory hormones. So those chemical messengers travel through this portal. It's a little vascular expressway that directly connects the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, and in turn affects the secretion of hormones by the anterior pituitary gland. So this is table 1 in chapter 18, hormones of the hypothalamus. So again, we see, for example, there is a growth hormone releasing hormone, and there's a growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So there we have the two contrasting hormones that would either say, hey, anterior pituitary, go ahead and make and secrete growth hormone, or don't do that. So there are release and inhibiting hormones for some of the anterior pituitary hormones. Now, the posterior pituitary gland is the point of release for oxytocin. Oxytocin affects the smooth muscle tissue in the female reproductive system, specifically the uterus and the ducts in the breasts. And this is the point of release for antidiuretic hormone ADH. So we'll follow up with both of these, a separate slide dedicated to each oxytocin and ADH. These are the two hormones we associate with the posterior pituitary gland. So this is table 2 in chapter 18. We see at top those two posterior pituitary hormones. The word neurohypophysis is the fancy word for the posterior pituitary. Below that, we see a much larger list for the anterior pituitary hormones. The adenohypophysis is the fancy term for the anterior lobe of the pituitary. All right, so this is a pretty cool figure. We're focusing on the posterior pituitary gland. We have a single hypothalamic neuroendocrine cell. If you follow that axon down, it's part of that tract. Shows ADH being released into the systemic circulation, and the target for ADH is the kidneys. Under the influence of ADH, we conserve more water. We have a reduction in urine volume that increases the urine's osmolality, which is essentially the salt versus water balance of a fluid. It would in turn decrease blood osmolality and increase blood volume and pressure. Now, the original stimuli for that comes from an increase in blood osmolality or a decrease in blood pressure. So up in the hypothalamus, we have osmoreceptors that are sensitive to the salt-water balance, and we have baroreceptors that are sensitive to blood pressure. So again, either a decrease in blood pressure or an increase in the relative salt versus water content of blood would be the original stimuli for the production and release of ADH. All right, now let's look at the anterior pituitary gland. There's a lot going on here. There are many hormones made by the cells of the anterior pituitary gland. First one, TSH, that is thyroid stimulating hormone. Pretty self-explanatory. This is a tropic hormone that targets the thyroid gland and stimulates the thyroid gland to do its thing. Growth hormone, that has body-wide effects on blood sugar levels, protein synthesis, cell growth. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. The standard initialism for that is ACTH. That is a tropic hormone that stimulates the adrenal cortex to make and release its hormones. MSH is melanocyte stimulating hormone, so that would stimulate melanocytes, which you remember are melanin producing cells in the skin. We have prolactin. The target there are the milk producing glands in the breasts. Follicle stimulating hormone. The follicles that are being stimulated here are the follicles in the gonads. FSH is a gonadotropic hormone, a tropic hormone that stimulates gonads. So the effect would be to accelerate egg maturation in ovaries and sperm production in testes. Luteinizing hormone is the other anterior pituitary gonadotropin. It also targets the gonads. The effect is to stimulate production of sex hormones. So this figure focuses on growth hormone, right? So we start way up at the top. Multiple variables regulate the production of the hypothalamic hormone called GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone. So for example, if you had low blood glucose levels, or if you were exercising, or if you were experiencing stress, those could increase production of GHRH. And that GHRH would travel through the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal, reach the anterior pituitary, cause the anterior pituitary to increase production of growth hormone. That in turn would enter your systemic circulation, affect your liver. That would increase production of glucose by the liver. It would stimulate the production of insulin-like growth factors that would affect the epiphyseal plates in bones if you're still a young person and cause them to grow, affect muscles, stimulate increase in muscle fiber size and in protein synthesis in muscles. With most important hormones, there are diseases or syndromes that are associated with hyper or hyposecretion. So with growth hormone, pituitary gigantism is a condition that happens when you chronically hypersecrete growth hormone. This is the world's tallest person who's ever officially been measured. Robert Wadlow was from Alton, Illinois. They called him the Alton Giant, and he was 8 feet 11 inches tall. He's standing next to his father, who's 6 feet tall, who looks like a midget next to him. Here's my own selfie with Robert Wadlow, at least a cardboard cutout of him. This is at the Old Bakery Brewery in Alton, so that's a life-size cutout of Robert Wadlow, and I'm standing next to him. I'm 6'2", so I look ridiculously small next to him. Now, Robert Wadlow experienced hypersecretion of growth hormone his entire life. He died at a young age, but he continually grew. Now, if you start hypersecreting growth hormone after you're already an adult, that creates a different condition called acromegaly. Now, your bones can't get longer, at least not your limb bones, but this would affect the growth of your hands, your jaw, your nose, your feet. So here we see a woman before and after the onset of hypersecretion of growth hormone as an adult, resulting in that condition we call acromegaly. All right, now we're going to move on to the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland produces 2 hormones that we collectively refer to as thyroxin, T3 and T4. The 3 and 4 here represent the number of iodine atoms in the molecule. So these are closely related thyroid hormones. Again, thyroxin is essentially the collective term for both of these. The thyroid gland also produces calcitonin, right? So T3 and T4 affect metabolic rate. Calcitonin is a calcium regulating hormone. These are some graphics of the thyroid gland. So we see it here just below the larynx. It's a bilobed organ. A little bridge connects the 2 halves. We saw this in lab. The functional units are these structures called follicles, right? They're made out of simple cuboidal epithelium. The thyroid follicles are the source of T3 and T4, and the parafollicular cells are the source of calcitonin. So this figure, it's kind of simplistic. It shows us that the stimulus for thyroid gland to make thyroid hormones comes from the anterior pituitary. That's thyroid stimulating hormone. And the stimulus for the production of thyroid stimulating hormone by the anterior pituitary is a hormone coming from the hypothalamus called TRH, thyroid releasing hormone. So we see this hormonal hierarchy here. TRH made by the hypothalamus triggers TSH by the anterior pituitary, which triggers thyroid hormones by the thyroid gland. Then we have negative feedback, right? What we'd call a short loop feedback would be elevated levels of thyroxine would cut off TSH by the anterior pituitary, and a long loop feedback would be the elevated levels of thyroxine affecting the hypothalamus, preventing TRH production. This is essentially the same figure with perhaps a bit more detail. It shows us that T3 and T4, the effects they have systemically, they increase your metabolic rate, your basal metabolic rate, which is essentially the rate at which you go through cell respiration. That would increase your body temperature, and that would be crucial in normal growth and development. And we also see the feedback loops, right? Elevated T3 and T4 levels can have a short loop feedback or a long loop feedback. This also shows us at the top end how hypothermia, being cold, or other stressors can be the trigger to the hypothalamus to make and release TRH, which would trigger the whole sort of cascade of communication to the thyroid gland. So as I mentioned on a previous slide, with our important thyroid glands and hormones, there are diseases and conditions associated with hyper and hyposecretion. So this is a good example. This is table 5 in chapter 18. There are some important conditions caused by hypothyroidism. That would be the thyroid gland underproducing hormones, versus hyperthyroidism. That would be the thyroid gland overproducing hormones. So we'll just pick a couple here. If you had an iodine deficiency, since we need iodine to make T3 and T4, that can cause problems, right? The thyroid gland couldn't do its job without those nutrients. So what we have is the pituitary gland is constantly yelling at the thyroid, yelling, I say in quotes. It is producing TSH saying, hey, thyroid gland, get on the ball and do your thing. The only thing the thyroid gland can do is get bigger. So the result is called a goiter, an enlarged thyroid gland. Hashimoto disease is an autoimmune. Oh, let's go back for a minute to iodine deficiency. That is dietary, right? This is why salt is iodinized. Most salt you buy at the store has iodine added to it. That's an easy way to get iodine in everyone's diet so you don't suffer from iodine deficiency. All right, Hashimoto disease. That's an autoimmune disease in which thyroid hormone secretion is depressed. Probably the most well-known hyperthyroidism is called Graves' disease. This is an autoimmune disease where you have an antibody that acts like TSH. So the thyroid gland thinks it's getting TSH from the pituitary. It's really an antibody. So that can also cause an enlarged thyroid gland, and it causes an unusual phenotype called exophthalmos, which means you have very prominent eyes. Your eyes seem to sort of bug out of your head. Check out this next image. This is a rather dramatic image of exophthalmos and an enlarged thyroid goiter caused by Graves' disease. So the parathyroid glands produce parathyroid hormone, PTH. Lots of our hormones have standard initialisms. You learned about PTH and ANP1 in the skeletal system. So PTH is triggered by hypocalcemia. If you have low levels of calcium, so this is a humoral stimulus to the parathyroid glands, they make PTH. Within our bones, that activates osteoclasts that break down bone matrix and liberate calcium. Kidneys have receptors for PTH. You would conserve more calcium from your filtered blood, and less calcium would wind up in your urine. And our intestines have receptors for PTH, and you would increase calcium absorption under the influence of PTH, all of which would cause calcium levels to rise. So when we got back into homeostasis, the humoral stimulus would be removed, and PTH production would temporarily cease. All right, on to the adrenal glands. So we spent some time in lab looking at the adrenal glands. We know that there are two major regions called the medulla and the cortex. So the medulla is the inner region of an organ. And within the adrenal medulla, we have the production of two important protein hormones, epinephrine, which is also called adrenaline, and norepinephrine, or noradrenaline. Their effects are very similar. So there's an image, again, showing us the kidney. Adrenal means on top of the kidney. So in this image, we see in number 1 there in the upper left, it says physical activity or low blood sugar levels or other stressors can stimulate your sympathetic nervous system. So axons from the sympathetic nervous system will innervate the adrenal medulla. This is neural stimulation, which causes the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine, and they have multiple targets. The liver increases the breakdown of glycogen into glucose. It would affect your heart, increasing the heart rate, affect vasoconstriction of digestive vessels, but dilation going to muscles, increasing cardiac output, affecting glycogen breakdown in muscles, right? So all of which would supply muscles with more glucose and more oxygen. All right, the adrenal cortex, by contrast, is the source of steroids. So there are 3 categories of steroids made by the adrenal cortex. These steroids, we call them the mineral corticoids, the glucocorticoids, and the androgens, right? So these are the 3 categories of steroid hormones made by the adrenal cortex. Now we'll follow this up on the next slide, but each of these hormones are made by a different zone in the adrenal cortex. So remember, the outermost zone of the cortex is called the zona glomerulosa. That is the source of aldosterone. Aldosterone is a hormone that affects sodium resorption by your kidneys. So it would increase the conservation or the uptake of sodium. Where sodium goes, water tends to follow. So the effect of aldosterone would be to cause you to retain sodium and then retain water, and that would boost your blood volume and in turn boost your blood pressure. The zona fasciculata secretes cortisol, and we'll learn more about cortisol in a minute, but that is a glucocorticoid that affects blood glucose levels. And then the zona reticularis is the source of androgens. Androgens, the most familiar androgen is testosterone, right? So testosterone is made by both males and females because if you have an adrenal gland and you have a functional cortex, you will make some androgens. All right, so this figure shows us at the top we see low blood glucose is the condition which stimulates the hypothalamus to make CRH. CRH is the hormone that stimulates the anterior pituitary to make ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, that enters your systemic circulation and causes the zona fasciculata to make cortisol, and cortisol in target tissues increases blood glucose levels, increases the breakdown of lipids and proteins for fuel for cell respiration, and has anti-inflammatory effects. This illustration is showing us some similar ideas. As you might know, cortisol is referred to as a stress hormone, right? So even like emotional stress can trigger the hypothalamus, activate the sympathetic nervous system. So we have kind of both parts of the adrenal gland active here in this figure. The sympathetic nervous system will cause the medulla to make epinephrine. That will result in what we call the fight or flight response. Those same stressors can cause, again, CRH and ACTH to be released. That can cause the adrenal cortex to make cortisol. That can affect your blood sugar levels. Okay, we're moving on now to the pancreas. So our pancreas is both an important endocrine organ and an important exocrine organ. The exocrine side is part of the digestive system. There are fluids produced by the pancreas that make their way through ducts to the small intestine, digestive enzymes, and pH adjusting secretions, as well as hormones, right? So both endocrine and exocrine functions. On the endocrine side, as we saw in lab, there are these little clusters of cells called islets, right? So the S is silent there. Islets are islands, little islands of cells that produce hormones that affect our blood sugar levels. So this is a graphic depicting the pancreas. It is kind of a weird organ. It's very diffused. Your pancreas is spread out in the mesenteries, all below your stomach and around the first big bend in your small intestine. When we look at the enlarged view there, we're seeing one full and parts of two other pancreatic islets. We also see the network of ducts that would serve the exocrine cells, the acinar tissue, and conduct those secretions to the small intestine. This is a nice histological view of an islet, or so-called islet of Langerhans. So we're going to talk about two primary hormones made by the pancreas. The first is insulin. The effect that insulin has is to lower blood sugar levels. The other primary hormone made by the pancreas is glucagon, which has the opposite effect. So we could really say these are antagonistic hormones. They have opposite effects. And glucagon increases blood sugar levels. So the stimulus for the release of these hormones is primarily humoral. So this is table 11 in chapter 18. It's comparing the effects of insulin and glucagon on different target tissues. If we look at the liver, for example, right? So this is a good example of how these two hormones have opposite effects. Under the influence of the liver, glucose is converted into glycogen, which is a polysaccharide. Under the effects of glucagon, the glycogen is broken down into glucose. Go back up one level in the table. Skeletal muscles are a primary target for insulin. Insulin increases the uptake of glucose from the bloodstream. It causes our cells to place more carrier proteins in the cell membranes that allow glucose to pass from the bloodstream and enter the muscle cells. This is kind of a, not kind of, it is a very busy figure, but it's sort of classic homeostasis. So we have little graphs there showing blood sugar levels, blood glucose levels. So if blood glucose levels increase, that is the trigger for the pancreas to produce insulin. Under the influence of insulin, muscle cells and liver cells will increase the uptake of glucose, so blood sugar levels will drop back to homeostatic levels, and insulin secretion will cease. If glucose levels drop too low, that inhibits the production of insulin. This figure shows us what happens immediately after versus 2 hours after you eat a meal. So you consume nutrients, carbohydrates, they're digested, they enter your bloodstream. This shows us the fate of glucose taken up under the influence of insulin. We can see that a majority of it is going to muscles, right? So it's going toward ATP synthesis or glycogen storage, right? So packing it away for later when we need that glucose. About 2 hours after a meal, though, blood sugar levels drop. That will result in insulin secretion decreasing and glucagon secretion increasing. Also an increasing growth hormone and cortisol, right? So there are multiple hormones that affect blood sugar levels. Look at that. Glucagon, growth hormone, and cortisol all essentially are synergistic, or at least they're all having similar effects to increase blood sugar levels versus insulin, which is antagonistic. It has the opposite effect, decreasing blood sugar levels. Now, diabetes is a common condition. As you probably know, there are different varieties of diabetes, and there may actually be more varieties than you realize. So the first thing I want to clarify about diabetes is that there are two major forms called diabetes insipidus versus diabetes mellitus. What most people are talking about when they say they're diabetic is diabetes mellitus. That is insulin related and blood sugar related. Diabetes insipidus is something totally different. Diabetes insipidus is actually hyposecretion of ADH. This is really a pituitary phenomenon. The only thing the two kinds of diabetes have in common is the same major issue of overproduction of urine, right? Without ADH, you're not absorbing as much water that gets filtered out by the kidneys, so you're producing lots of urine, whereas in diabetes mellitus, The polyuria, the high urine output, is really osmotically based. You have high blood sugar levels, so there's a lot of glucose in the filtrate, and that causes water to hang around, and that causes an increase in urinary volume. Now, with diabetes mellitus, there are these three signs or symptoms called the polys. That would be polyuria, overproduction of urine, polydipsia, thirst, all the time you're thirsty, and polyphagia is you're hungry all the time, right? So with diabetes mellitus, your blood sugar levels are high, but the glucose can't enter your cells. Now, you've probably heard of type 1 and type 2 diabetes mellitus. Type 1 is what used to be called juvenile onset diabetes. That is thought to be an autoimmune disease where the islet cells are destroyed by your immune system. You are unable to produce insulin, so you have chronic hyperglycemia and you have to give yourself insulin injections. Type 2 diabetes is more related to diet and obesity. Typically, that happens later in life. They might call that mature onset or adult onset diabetes. And that is an issue with insensitivity of insulin receptors, right? So it may not be that you're hypo-producing insulin, but rather your insulin receptors are not sensitive. Man, the discovery of insulin and its effects and the ability to manufacture it and isolate it was an important breakthrough in the treatment of diabetes mellitus. This is a rather dramatic photograph showing one of the first successful clinical applications of insulin injections to treat type 1 diabetes. This is a child who was literally starving to death because they could not produce insulin. The glucose was in their bloodstream but couldn't enter their cells. And there's the same kid after treatment with insulin injections. Okay, we're getting to the end of this presentation. We're going to mop it up by talking about some hormones made by structures that you may not normally think of as being endocrine structures. I'm just calling them miscellaneous hormones. Okay, the first is the stomach. Right? You might be surprised to learn that your stomach makes hormones. And hey, what an appropriate name for a stomach hormone, gastrin. Gastrin is made by cells in the stomach. It enters your systemic circulation, and guess what cells it targets? It also targets the stomach. So it's made by the stomach and it targets the stomach, right? So under the influence of gastrin, gastric constriction increases and the production of enzymes and acids increase. Did you know your heart makes hormones? If your blood volume is high and your blood pressure is high and your atria are overstretched as they're refilling between heartbeats, your atria will make a hormone called ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide. Natriuretic, that's the key. Na is sodium and uretic refers to urine. The target cells for ANP are your kidneys. So under the influence of ANP, you reabsorb less of the sodium that you filter out. I mentioned where sodium goes, water follows. So you would pee more, and that would lower your blood volume, and that would lower your blood pressure. Your pineal gland, right? You might remember looking for this on the models and on the sheep skulls in ANP1. It produces a hormone called melatonin, and we'll follow up with an image about melatonin in a second. All right, this our last slide in this presentation focuses on melatonin. So melatonin is made by the pineal gland. Light entering your eye causes action potentials to travel through the optic nerve, right? Those impulses eventually make their way to the pineal gland. And light striking the eye inhibits melatonin. So it is in darkness that we increase melatonin production. And melatonin is thought to help us regulate sleep cycles. In fact, they sell melatonin as a sleep aid. So one thing I want to stress here is how having lights on in the room at night really is counterproductive. Right? People who sleep without any light, no night light, no light coming in through the windows, no TV on, actually tend to increase melatonin production and get more sound sleep than if you leave lights on. So think about that. If you can avoid lights at night, it could potentially help you getting a better night's sleep. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up, and our next lecture will move on to the cardiovascular system and talk about blood.